We are taking a closer look at language today and how some languages are under threat with fewer people speaking them. And this is driven by politics. That should resonate across many parts of Asia. Specifically, we will focus on Cantonese, spoken by 80 million Chinese around the world. Beijing favors Mandarin, another popular Chinese language, as the official language of China for all 1.4 billion people, which means other languages within its borders, including Cantonese, are in decline. That has stirred some people to try to preserve the language, and it's in the United States, of all places, where that's happening.
This school in San Francisco is offering classes in Cantonese, the prevalent language spoken among the Chinese diaspora in the city. Despite having a long waiting list, the principal is worried about the future of her mother tongue.
Cantonese is such a rich, diverse, rigorous language, and then with an attempt to sort of eliminate it, it is very sad.
She's referring to a shift in her hometown, Hong Kong. Here, Cantonese is still used by 90% of its population. But Mandarin, a variety of Chinese standardized and promoted by Beijing, is becoming more common on the streets. More mainland Chinese have settled in Hong Kong without speaking the language. This, in addition to the local government's policy to favor Mandarin in schools. The situation is even more acute next door in Guangzhou. Under Beijing's push for linguistic unity, Mandarin became the dominant medium of instruction in schools, and many citizens preferred language of communication.
Which is worrying. In the past, people from everywhere who came to Guangzhou would be able to speak Cantonese because of the peers. Their peers would teach them. The peers would teach them Cantonese in the past. But now only Cantonese families can pass on the language to the kids.
Back in San Francisco, the language is also a less favorable choice for many students eager to learn Chinese. Mandarin classes are far more popular because it's seen to be better for doing business in China. Most of the students here learn Cantonese for family reasons.
My dad speaks Cantonese, my family speaks Cantonese, and I never really learned it fully growing up and wanted to be able to have conversations with my grandma.
In the city's famous Chinatown, these Cantonese speakers are well aware of the danger their lingo is facing. They're trying to use it whenever they could, so their culture can be preserved for as long as possible.
To get into this a bit more, joining me now in the studio is DW reporter Hang Shun-Li, who speaks Cantonese, and actually both of us speak Cantonese, although yours is much better. So for the viewers who don't speak this language, why is this a big deal?
Well, Melissa, we're talking about a language that is spoken by 80 million people, so it's not really just a minor dialect in China, and it's an extremely common Chinese language among the Chinese communities in the UK or in the US, for example, because of early immigration patterns. I mean, as a US citizen, you probably can confirm that.
Yeah, I mean, people in Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, right, also will hear this language.
Yeah, exactly, because it also used to be a business language in Southeast Asia, so that's why some elderly people in Malaysia, for example, still speak the language. And historically, it's also been said that Cantonese is a much older language. It's thought to have been originated in about 220 AD, and it's much closer to the ancient Chinese language that people used to speak during that time. And meanwhile, Mandarin was recorded in about the 14th century, I think, and it only got populated across China by the Communist Party after it took power in 1949.
I mean, so that's a 1,000-year difference, and then Mandarin in that context is pretty new. So just how different are the two languages?
Well, they sound completely different. Now, to give you an example, let's say DW is the best news channel to watch.
Right
so,
on.
in Mandarin, it would be DW 是最好看的新闻台. And in Cantonese, it's DW 係最好睇嘅新聞台.
I mean, it sounds really different to my ears.
Yes, they are different. And in fact, Mandarin and Cantonese both have completely different sets of grammar rules and vocabulary. So if one only speaks Cantonese, he or she would not be able to understand a Mandarin speaker and vice versa. And by the way, there's always been a debate about whether Cantonese is a dialect of Mandarin or not. A linguist would say that no, they are two separate languages because they're not mutually intelligible. But actually, within mainland China, it's politically correct to refer to different Chinese languages, including Cantonese and Mandarin, as dialects.
And just to give viewers a sense, it's actually more unintelligible between, say, Portuguese and Spanish speakers sometimes can understand each other. These two languages are far more distant.
Well, yes, or more or less, I would say more or less the same, like as Portuguese and Spanish, or German and Dutch, for example, and maybe a little bit more distant from each other.
Now, Beijing's decision to elevate Mandarin has had an impact on Cantonese. So how is that playing out in China these days?
Well, it has received it has drawn some backlash for 2 times already. And just very recently, there was an outcry on China's most popular video platform, Douyin, which is TikTok's sister app. And their Cantonese speakers said that they were quitting the platform because their Cantonese live streams got interrupted. Now, here's a goodbye video from one of the users.
呢段時間咧，我哋都好少喺抖音上面做直播啦。原因好簡單嚇，就係平台對我哋啲粵語主播咧限流，甚至封號。咁佢哋嘅理由就好簡單，佢就係話無法識別語言。其實呢個係好荒謬嘅理由嚟嘅。我而家下邊呢啲字幕全部係佢哋自己平台自己自動配上去嘅，佢居然話冇辦法識別。我哋粵語有成億幾人喺度講。比全世界好多嘅國家嘅人口仲要多。既然你咁落後，就唔值得擁有我哋呢一班咁優質嘅粵語用戶。拜拜。
Now, this video we just saw was later posted on Weibo, which is another Chinese social media platform, and it got widespread support from other users. So one user wrote, for example, Cantonese cannot be dumbed. It's a living fossil of the ancient Chinese language. If Cantonese disappears, Chinese culture will become even less colorful. And another user wrote, don't give up your local language. That's real Chinese. Mandarin is just an emotionless tool for communication. And of course, there were others who were being less supportive and critical. So one user actually asked, so why not learn Mandarin properly? And others are being very, very analytical, writing, well, they are banning the language because the staff cannot understand it. And if there's extremist content and the government demands accountability, the platform cannot provide it. And I think what this user is trying to illustrate is that social media companies are increasingly under pressure to control speech online, and having different languages would just complicate their efforts.
Right. I mean, talking about control in China, I think it's worth mentioning to people listening that it's not just Cantonese in China that's facing problems. In fact, Tibetan, Mongolian, Uyghur, they're under greater threat within the borders of China. And I think it really emphasizes to the extent Xi Jinping wants this national unity, the singular language. So how do different languages create unique identities?
Well, I mean, language is never just a tool for communication. It's always linked to a local culture, a local identity. Let's take Hong Kong, for example. Having a separate language, which is Cantonese, somehow reinforced the idea that the city is different from the rest of China. And there, even if Mandarin has become much more common, people understand it much better than before, a lot of people are still reluctant to speak the language because for them it's somehow a reminder of what they call the mainlandization of Hong Kong.
And so ultimately, how worried are you about Cantonese?
Well, as a Cantonese speaker, of course, I'm worried, not just because of the political pressure, but a language can also wane when people decide to abandon the language voluntarily because another lingo gets more prestigious socially and economically. And I certainly don't hope that would be the case.
Hang Shun Li, thank you so much for joining us.